Large Language Models session. Thank you everyone for being here, and special thanks to Danilo, Edbert, and Douglas for having submitted their work and being here today. This is going to work as usual. We will have 3 presentations today, 20 minutes each, followed by 10 minutes discussion, and then we open for questions from the audience. The papers are Minnesota BART, which will be presented by Professor Edbert Lopes, Quantifying Deregulation and Its Economic Effects, an LLM approach, which will be presented by Danilo Cascaldi Garcia from the Federal Reserve, and Harnessing AI for Monitoring Financial Markets, which will be presented by my colleague from the Central Bank of Brazil, Douglas Araújo. We'll be starting with Professor.
Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank the organizers to allow me to talk a little bit about one of my students' work. Pedro is doing a PhD at UT Austin. He did his undergrad in the Faculty of Economics at USP, Ribeirão Preto, and he's a very bright co-author. So all mistakes you see here are mine, not his. He's the one doing the hard work, and I'm just like gibberishing about things. And the name of the talk is not about the Simpsons. So even though the Simpsons live somewhere in Minnesota or in that part of the country, BART is a statistical approach to modeling non-parametrically regressions. It's a predictive model that falls into the same group of neural networks, splines, and a bunch of other similar tools. So what we're going to do here, it's quite simple. We're just going to, adapt the famous, well-established type of priors that were introduced by Dole, Littimer, and Sims 45 years ago, the Minnesota prior. And we model a VAR through a BART, and the way we construct the trees is using this kind of prior that penalizes the depth of the tree. So let me go ahead and talk about it. So I guess I can just look at this computer here. So here's a helicopter view of VAR, so I don't need that for this audience. Standard approach, linear Gaussian, just to start with, where M is the number of variables, P is the number of lags. We have the curse of dimensionality if M increases, and nowadays VARs are being built with 500 times series. And so imagine like 500 by 500 phi matrices, 10 times. So you have like a huge amount of parameters to learn. And from a Bayesian point of view, we are very capable of doing that. We have a lot of knowledge of penalizing, even though nowadays people in machine learning think that they discovered penalization. We've done this for the last 200 years, or I've done this for the last 30 years, which is like tuning or thinking carefully about prior specification. And the Minnesota prior was essentially building on the priors for these coefficients. Okay. Here's like a brief, I'm not gonna go through that. Essentially the bullets, how the Bayesian evolved through modeling VARs. Initially, we had very small size VARs, like 4, 5, 6, 10 variables that spanned from 1985 to, well, roughly the early 80s to the mid 2000s, with this, the pinnacle of this first group by the paper by Primichetti, a friend of mine, professor at the Northwestern University. And what he did was combining VAR with coefficients that vary over time, plus stochastic volatility. They use a scholastic decomposition for the covariance matrices that I've proposed in another Journal of Econometrics paper. But then after that, everything was solved. People started wondering about time-varying parameter, MCMC, sample importance resampling, and a bunch of other computational strategies to perform Bayesian inference. Then, in the 2010s, around that, or in the last 10 to 15 years, we've had like the ambitions to go from large to huge. And I guess the next one will be humongous or whatever, like as we increase the number of variables. Of course, we're talking about social sciences here. If you're talking about to biologists, for them, large is like millions of variables. And that's where all these penalty functions really work, because they're modeling DNA and all that. But for us, 500 time series is good enough. So if I want to model the S&P 500 or 500 companies, we can do that using these models. And a third wave is modeling non-parametrically either the linear function that defines the response, the lags, but also the error. The error term can be non-parametric. So you could have a Gaussian process, a BART, or anything else here for the mean, but also model the distribution of the errors as a Dirichlet process, which means that it's highly non-parametric. And these people do that, and that's what we're going to do in one direction. So we're going to do in this direction of using BART for VAR. So those are two inspiring papers. We built upon these two papers here, and we add the Minnesota prior. Okay. So the Minnesota prior in one slide is basically, you basically say, I'm gonna move from the AR1 individual AR1 time series to a multivariate AR1 as a baseline. So just pile up all the time series and say the first matrix will be like just a random walk. So 1 in the diagonal, 0 off diagonal, and all the other legs will be 0. That's the mean of the prior. The variance of the prior is something that is driven by lambda 1 and lambda 2. And as you move in the legs, you decrease the variance. But remember, the means are 0. So if I'm decreasing the variance, I'm shrinking higher legs. And also, if I'm looking at one equation, for instance, inflation, all the legs of inflation will have a little bit higher variance than the variances of the other coefficients for the other time series, which means that you're going to privilege ARPs of the own variable other than the other components of the VAR. So that was basically the idea. Remember, 1975, 1978, 1980. And by doing that, they were able to implement, at that time, large VARs and program and do things, and that became like a norm in many places. Here are a few references. Okay. And as I mentioned, like in 2 slides back here, where this time varying parameter and then the stochastic volatility, we do that as well. And actually, I've been working on stochastic volatility, multivariate stochastic volatility for a while now. So again, now I have the standard VAR, but I'm putting like covariance matrix for the errors of this gigantic VAR. And the way we do that is through a factor stochastic volatility decomposition. It's similar to a Cholesky decomposition, but imagine like you have a Cholesky decomposition that you stop at a particular column, and then you become like a kind of a building, a triangular, but don't go all the way to the end. By doing that, we reduce drastically the number of components from M to R. So if M is 500, I can bet here with anyone else, if you get like 500 time series, no matter where from, you're not going to find more than 10 factors or 15 factors. Impossible, almost impossible. It's like a empirical information, but you're never going to find anything more than that, unless you mix data from different areas. So going from 500 to 10 or 20, even 50, makes computation very feasible. And because we are using this factor stochastic volatility decomposition, we don't need to model directly sigma t. What we do is we model omega, which is diagonal, age, which is also diagonal, and lambda is the loading matrix. So everything is more or less established. Again, a bunch of references down here, all the way back to Mike Pitt and Neil Shepard. And more recently, my work with Kastner and Silver Furich Schneider. Okay. So our contribution is this slide here. So thank you. I'm done here. We combine what Linero, like Antonio Linero is a young faculty from UT Austin. Remember, like Pedro is at UT Austin doing his PhD. And what Linero did was, when we fit BART, which I will explain in a minute because I still have like 12 minutes, he showed that if you fit a BART and you need with too many variables, you're going to run into troubles. So you have to think about shrinking the prior. So it's already like a direction of shrinking the prior. And what we do is we build on that direction and say, okay, but we are now in a very specific subset of multivariate VAR structures. Okay. So what we do is for each time series, so here's the equation of the VAR. So YT, remember, YT is a vector of variables that you want to model through a VAR. And now instead of making a linear function of the legs in XT, like as you see here, what we do is let's make this generic for now. So if it's linear, we are back into the traditional linear VAR. But we're going to use BART for this function here. And in fact, the way it's written here, we're basically saying each one of the equations of my VAR, the same way as the linear one, is modeled through a different BART. So it's a different non-linear function. Plus the error, which is a factor stochastic volatility. And one thing that I didn't mention is that allowing sigma t to follow this factor stochastic volatility allows me to model equation by equation conditioning on everything else, which means that I transform a large VAR into univariate non-parametric BART VAR. And of course, within a large MCMC scheme, we sample everything together. We don't do a two-stage procedure here. All the uncertainty of all unknowns are based on the data that we observe, nothing else. So the full hierarchical model that we are fitting here, we're considering, is the response is a vector of macro variables, for instance, functions of BART, and then the factors, the linear factors that will help me explain the volatility, the multivariate covariance matrix. And then here are the stochastic volatility for the components of the factors, and then also for the components of the specific factors, common factors and specific factors. And as this sounds like very straightforward, our MCMC scheme will cycle through a bunch of blocks, and each one of them were, specialized, tuned in over the last 10, 15 years. So if you're working on factor stochastic volatility, if you're working on factor analysis, you're working on BART. So each one of those you pick in your shelf, all these MCMC strategies, put them together and run your model. So this is straightforward for someone that works in this field. So it might sound like weird and all that, but it's just a combination of a bunch of things that we all dominate for like 20 years now. So I only have a few minutes I still have like 8 minutes, but I want to just show one slide of what is a tree and why that makes sense. So BART is a sum of trees. So a tree is a representation. You give me the regressors, and I just make a path to relate that path to the response variable. So each tree can be written as a partition of the space of variation of the covariates. In this case, imagine X1 and X1 and X3 are the legs of inflation, for instance. So instead of going through a plane as a linear function, so you have beta 1 coefficient, beta 2 coefficient, what we have is this square, and the height of the square, mu1, mu2, and mu3, defines the planes, which is parallel. So the trick here is, as a Bayesian, we have to think about the structure of the tree. So we put priors on the structure, how trees are built or how trees are generated in your MCMC scheme. So as I said, like each one of those will be a sum of trees. So each row of my VAR has sums of trees, and what I need to do is to specify the structure of the tree and the parameters within the structure. So in the previous pages, why this square with that particular cuts, particular blocks, and why mu1, mu2, and mu3. So conditioning on the squares, mu1, mu2, and mu3 will become more or less stable, easy to sample from. The main difficult part is to think about the trees. And we do like stochastic search in the space of trees for that. Okay. So BART prior, everything here is just like computation. The main thing that we're going to do in our case is when we are thinking about trees like this, at any given point, when you propose a new tree, you think about which variable I'm going to put here on the top, x1, let's say inflation lag 1. Then you go in a particular direction and you're going to include another variable here. It could be like unemployment lag 3. What we're going to do with the Minnesota prior is say, if we're going down here, if this is inflation x1 and the response variable is also inflation, it will be a higher probability that the next cut will be also inflation lag 2 or even lag 1. It doesn't matter because it doesn't have to be like consecutive. It could be anything. But the point is, if you prioritize lags of the own variables or lags of higher, closer responses as opposed to lag 5, 6, 7, 8, we're actually mimicking the behavior of the Minnesota prior. That's the contribution. That's basically what we're going to do here. And for those who are interested in this thing, you can go to UT Austin, the Stock Tree AI, where they have all this code available, packages for specific areas. They are like, it's an army of people working on these derivations. Okay. So the BART splitting rule, what we do is basically, we don't do the standard categorical split of 1 over k. We're going to give like higher probability to lags of the own variable. So here's one example, which I'm not going to go through because I don't have a lot of time, but it's a standard example in machine learning people use to compare BART and stuff like that. And what he shows is that if you compare BART to random forest, these methods, they fail is if you increase the number of variables on the right-hand side. So if you have a VAR, which is my case, I have 10 variables here, but I have 100 variables as explanatory variables, I'm in this situation. So BART's not going to work. For random forest, even though I'm sure people never heard of BART, but random forest beats BART anywhere of the day, in any country. Okay, so we can erase this last one. BART fails in this case because it's using a prior that is not, prioritizing any one of the regressors. So what Antonio Linero proposed was, well, let's weight the regressors differently and allow more important variables to go first and last. And that's what happens in this middle one. So he uses a different prior for the splitting of the trees. That's what he calls the dart prior. Essentially, instead of 1 over k, he has alpha, and alpha is what controls. If alpha is 1, we go back to the equally weighted. And but if alpha is a bigger number, that spreads differently. It becomes more or less informative. And this is our slide. So we do that, and you say, look, all the regressors, which I call here S1M to SKM, all those regressors, which means like the probability of proposing this particular variable in the next branch, the next branch of the tree, is given by a Dirichlet, like a probability distribution for probability distributions or probabilities. And here we translate the Minnesota prior to that angle. So basically, by allowing these different weights, we see that we are in different ranges of this simplex, more here or more in this corner. And as I said, the Bayesian inference is basically combining what we already have in BART and other linear conditional means coefficients, like the VAR. And the MCMC becomes straightforward, even though it takes time and you have to do tuning in terms of how to make this faster and competitive. Okay. And one thing we do is we compute posterior inclusion probability for a particular variable. So the posterior inclusion probability, we navigate through the trees, and then we take how often that particular variable enters the system. There are many ways of doing that. We're doing a very naive one. We just, if it appears there, we count. One thing we're changing is we want to see how often it appears and where it does appear, and say weight that to make sure that we are giving proper weights to the variables. Okay. So here's the real example that we're playing with, which is a data set that everyone has used in the past. We don't have like a very large example yet, 22 time series, data spanning from 65 2019 quarterly data, and we look at 1, 2, 3, 4 out of sample forecast. And we compare models based on this traditional root, mean square, predictive error. Okay. And the baseline we do is a BVAR FSV, so there's no BART here, and we use a Minnesota price. So this is the baseline, which is already a very sophisticated model. Right? One slide, while I still have 40 seconds, one slide is showing that it's hard to see what's there because, well, that's something that Pedro did, so I have to ask him to make this bigger. So I just highlighted this right here. So we are looking at 3 types of models: BART with FSV, BART with a sparse prior, no uniform prior, and then the Minnesota FSV is like a BART with a Minnesota prior. So ours is the red one. So we are always, always winning when comparing this for instance, the Fed funds in this case, for T+1 to T+4. Of course, there is the same picture for other variables. The discussant will probably tell you that. And then I can compute the inclusion probability for instance, the Minnesota prior, which is this last one. You see that it does bring the Minnesota prior kind of behavior, like this is smoothing going down in the legs. If you do like a BART, it's going to pick everyone. So the model will be highly noisy. If you do just like sparse FSV with BART, but don't use a Minnesota prior, then everything goes to 0 almost. So you're in the 2 extremes. So our proposal actually, we want to go down to 0, but we want to learn something here in the beginning. So the first initial legs of all variables should be allowed to participate in the modeling. Okay. Predictive scoring as opposed to root mean square error, and as opposed to posterior inclusion probability, you can just look at this cumulative predictive density score, which is something that instead of looking at errors, we look at the height of the density, posterior densities, and our model is the one in black here. In red. So ours is the one in red. So higher the better, because higher likelihood, right? So we're always like winning or competing with some other models, and the standard baseline is pretty bad. So I'm not going to talk about sensitivity to the prior. I'm going to close with this final remarks. We're advancing multivariate BART for high dimensional analysis. So this is one challenge we have. We are talking about priors for specific structure of models, so we can take advantage of that in our application. And there, of course, we're still working on how we're going to create impulse response functions and other entities that you guys are more used to when comparing or doing analysis. Another one that is missing here is how we transfer this to a structural model. Like how do you do a structural Minnesota BART, for instance, to match what exists for the SVAR literature. 10%.
Danilo for comments, please.
Thanks everybody for inviting me and be able to discuss this paper. I'm Danilo. I work at the Federal Reserve, so the usual disclaimer applies. The views are my own, even though I don't know if they would bother much if I talk about econometrics, but yeah. So it was a pleasure to discuss this paper, especially because it's the second time that I read it. I know Pedro who's my colleague from Ribeirão Preto, so he already had sent me the paper 1 year ago, I think, so I already had read it and sent some comments, which I was actually happy that most of them were already implemented. My discussion is going to be focused more on selling the paper and in terms of structure, because I believe that in terms of methods, the paper is very well set. Is a very nice econometric contribution, that I'm also very looking forward to put in practice to see how it performs in comparison to other forecasting models. So the idea of what the paper does, so the core problems that, like, standard Bayesian VARs, they are linear. And BART is a nice alternative by bringing trees to the VAR literature. They're quite flexible. But the current available alternative of like bringing BART to the VAR, which the Huber and Rossini of 2022, is oblivious to time structure, which is something that if we're thinking about a time series model, maybe that's something that we should care about. So all lags are treated equally. And it's also oblivious to sparsity. So all predictors are treated equally. And those are the two main core points that the method that, as far as I understand, that the Minnesota BART can tackle. So basically, they bring like two structured priors on split probabilities, which is the DART, which is a Dirichlet sparsity, which gives some automatic variable selection, and the Minnesota style decay, which is quite is a quite nice addition, which penalize higher order and cross variable lags. So just like in a very simple chart, the key model structure, we have like YT dependent on a non-parametric function of XT, and our residuals, they follow a factor structure on the volatilities. All the variables, they share a linear factor component, and they so we have like an idiosyncratic error and a common stochastic volatility. And what is nice that conditional on factors, we have n independent BART regressions, which can give a lot of like computational gain because you can do this thing equation by equation, which is a quite nice addition to that. So what changed in terms of split of the prior? So this is a type of like a picture that I try to put it here, comparing what's the baseline BART. I may or may not confess that AI helped me doing this, but the main one of Ruber and Rossini, you can see like that by the root, they split between the branches. So for example, it doesn't matter which lag it is. It can be that like the data T-9 tells you that you should go to another branch, and then you go back to T-3 or T-1. There's not a clear lag structure or variable selection for you to actually go down that tree, which may be even like a problem with like overfitting and all. With the Minnesota BART, then you start disciplining that, like variables that are like we learn from decades of evidence that own lag of their own variables usually dominates in terms of forecasting. So why should I just let the model be free to pick whatever it believes it could be like the best on that split of the tree? Let's just like put much more emphasis or probability on my own lag, and with a proper lag structure in terms of lags. And this is done through some like to the Dirichlet probability and an adaptation to the equivalent of the Minnesota prior. Okay, so as I said, a uniform distribution on that split is unrealistic. We know that their own variables, they are quite useful to forecast the next step. Okay. So, and then here comes my main points for the paper. So the first one, I would do even though it's like on the title, Minnesota BART, I would do a stronger link to the Minnesota prior. We have the classic Minnesota prior, again, like that we're assuming or like having like a prior that the variables are a random walk. Here with the Minnesota prior, that is done through this split on the tree. I would do like one own section explaining putting the side by side what is the direct link between the Minnesota prior and the Minnesota BART. So where the assumptions that we have in the Minnesota prior, they match the assumptions on the BART, which is quite nice. They're all there, so it's more a matter of exposition. So I would make this distinction quite explicit. That the Minnesota prior is preserved like in the selection layer, not in the value of the variable layer. Okay, So this, I think, it would be like a very good selling point for especially the people who work on the Minnesota prior environment. In terms of framing and presentation, so first thing, so there's kind of like two ways of going here, like, and Edbert already like posed a little bit in terms of structural. The way that the model is set up or it's presented, for me, it's quite clear as a forecasting exercise. It's a method that's really good for us to test forecasting. It's much harder to think on this on a structural way because it's non-parametric, so it's difficult to think about standard structural identification, even though like I was starting, while representing, starting to have second thoughts, because with the structure that you impose on the variance covariance, you may bring some sort of standard identification there as well. So there are two ways of going. One is that, you know, you keep this structure, this is a forecasting paper, and then you boost the forecasting exercise comparison with other models, and that's the main point. If you want to bring kind of like a structural identification, then you need to really put like an example, or like see like these are areas that we can do. We can do generalized impulse responses, we can do local projections, so show us that this is a feasible option with the method. The second comment is, this is more like in terms of exposition, you can always compare the BART with the sparse and the Minnesota BART. I was kept like having to go back to actually understand what was the sparse. Now I understood, like from the presentation. I would put some sort of like comparison like that, just like a simple table showing like what is each one bringing to the table, like the pure BART or just the sparse, and the combination of the two, which is quite nice. Okay. In terms of like of the forecasting exercises, like I think like my main comment. Your sample ends in 2019 Q4. So there's like the elephant in the room, which is like COVID. You have stochastic volatility that like we know by some additional, I did some work on how to deal with the pandemic as well. And stochastic volatility is usually quite good to take care of these very like non-traditional or like outlier movements in the data. And one of the core motivation of the paper is that large shocks, they break linearity. But your sample stops before the largest post-war macro shock. So there is a little bit of this tension on that. So I think the very first thing that I would do, you have your model, or have stochastic volatility. This should help a lot on dealing with COVID. And even when comparing with other models, they will also have the same problem. So I would extend the sample through 2025 and see how the model goes through. One very small, you stop the forecast horizons at h equals 4. It's usually known in the forecasting literature that like Bayesian VRs, they are quite good at more longer horizons than like in shorter horizons. Just extend to 2 and 3 years ahead, maybe. And then on the forecasted variables. So first I would be very, like I would keep always the same variables on every exercise that you're doing, because you do like GDP, federal funds rate, and CPI. In some exercise GDP, some exercise you focus on the federal funds rate. When you get to the PIP analysis, it was the CPI. So first of all, I would not do the forecast on the federal funds rate. This is implicitly you estimating a non-parametric monetary policy reaction function, which is not really like motivated. Usually the federal funds rate is going to be kind of like closing the model with like how GDP and CPI are behaving. I would focus on GDP and CPI, and throughout the paper, you do all the exercises. Sometimes you do better, sometimes not as much, and I would focus always on GDP and CPI for all the exercises, both for point forecast, for density, and also on the PIP analysis. I think this is going to be a much cleaner narrative, because when you pick and choose variables, you may make someone understand that you didn't want to show the other variable, which is not the case. On the empirical results, this is small. I would also use ratio, not levels, for the density evaluations. The figures on relative root mean squares, they are super clean and comparable, easy to understand. The one on the cumulative log ratio is a little bit harder. So I would do something either like the kind of like a difference between your baseline, or using the CRPS, which kind of like more comparable to the root mean square error. And also, like on the sections 5.5, the PIP analysis, I find it super interesting. I learned a lot from that, but it seems that you go on out of sample and go back to in sample. So I would bring this before. I think this is a very good point that you finished like on the paper. I would bring this earlier on the paper and then go to your out of sample analysis. Also, the lambda robustness is, I think, it's a little bit undersold. It's quite nice that you show that the Minnesota specs, they beat BART regardless of lambda. So you can actually bring that earlier on as well. So just to summarize, like, it's a very cool paper. I'm pretty much looking forward on putting my hands on and trying it compare with other models. Super nice. It's an elegant translation of the Minnesota shrinkage. We have all these extra layers that bring it like closer to the Minnesota road. We see the density forecast gains over the BVAR with stochastic volatility. They are consistent across configurations, which is really hard to beat. So this is quite nice. And the results are quite like straightforward as well. My suggestions are more based on the framing. So you can focus just on forecasting, but if you want to do a structure, I would really bring that to give examples there. Extend the sample, focus on 2 specific variables and go with that, and the others are smaller points, and that's it.
No, I'll wait for the audience if they have questions. I have just one comment, which is a funny one, because you mentioned what is this sparse Minnesota, and last week I talked to Pedro. I was like, "Is this what we're doing? Like this? And he asked. So it was not in the paper. I was looking at everywhere. I was like, why are we using this? And how do we specify that? But that's basically the uniform prior for that. So it's not in the paper, as you pointed out. And actually, I want these slides because that's basically a referee report, and I will tell Pedro to work on this as soon as we can.
Yeah, he texted me already asking for
the slides.
Yeah.
We're taking questions from the audience now.
Thanks, Edbert. So I really like the fact that you're working on deriving IRFs from this approach, but echoing Danilo's comments, if this paper is really a racehorse between forecasting methods. When you compare tree-based models, you mentioned that BART beats random forests anytime, but usually so do boosting models. And you briefly mentioned that the downside of it is the time it takes to tune the hyperparameters. But since this becomes less and less of an issue with parallel computing and Bayesian optimization, it would be very nice if you give it a chance to boosting models to, like in the framing of your work to make it clear that it also beats boosting.
Yeah, I mean, I don't say that here, but when I give talks about BART or other applications, I always say that the BART is a Bayesian clean version of what boosting does, because boosting is like searching, optimizing a particular path deterministically, as we are doing a stochastic search of a space of trees. But yes, they are much closer than random forests and other types of trees. That's a good point. Thank you.
Any other questions? Would you like to comment?
Yeah, one comment on your your comment on impulse response functions. They are like something very important that people use all the time when they do. It doesn't have to be like structural, because impulse response functions are nothing but how the system evolves or how the system reacts. If you want to understand what they represent in terms of shocks in monetary policy, then you need this structural to give names to those shocks. But if you just say, look, this is how things are, this takes longer to go back to zero, but it's still useful. But when he mentioned, like, one thing we can do is, like, instead of using the factor stochastic volatility for sigma t, we can move sigma t or to in front of the responses to have like an A matrix in a structural sense with T as well, like Xi, Sims, and others have done that with a time varying structural component. It will be more complicated if you do. It will be more complicated if you do in terms of splitting the several equations, as we are doing now.
We have another question.
Yeah, I have a question. Sort of continuing on this line of comparison with boosting, because I believe boosting is probably the most used model in tabular applications everywhere. And it seems that BART is sort of a drop-in improvement because you get the benefits of a additive tree ensemble, but you also get sort of free uncertainty quantification. And it seems that the cost is perhaps more complexity and inference time. So my question would be if you believe that the BART ecosystem is mature enough today to drop in and replace boosting applications for general machine learning.
I didn't understand the final part of your discussion. What are you asking? If I believe what?
Sort of what is stopping everyone from just replacing boosting, which is used everywhere, with BART and getting free uncertainty quantification?
Oh, it's simple. Simple answer. Go to my classes. You know, the non-Bayesian econometricians in this country, they don't care. They know they are going to lose everything. They just don't do it. Just teach like BART, and then you're going to see how fast it is. Simple as that.
Anyone else? Well, thank you. Oh.
Very nice paper. A quick question, actually. I was intrigued. Why did you choose to use the quarterly version of the data set that has fewer variables compared to the monthly data, and then focus, for example, on inflation, where then you can use 100 plus variables?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I have to ask like Pedro. But essentially, I probably follow up these other papers, like one of the papers we cite, they do BART for that same data set. Probably just use what they did, but that's a good point. It's similar to some of these questions about, you know, I think we're now at a point where we do have like the technology, we have like a lot of questions to answer, and one of them is to make it cleaner how the data analysis is, which spending more time on this part of the paper, including like explaining why we do that, and maybe move to another data set, excluding Fed funds, and maybe even the whole data set, picking another one. Thank you.
Oh, coming up next, Danilo.
So thanks a lot for including, if you like this, the timers. Yeah. Thanks a lot for including our paper like in the program. So it's a joint work with Matteo Iacoviello. We're both at the Fed, so usual disclaimer applies. So we're talking here about quantifying the regulation and its economic effects, and we're using a large language model approach for that. So let's see if this is working. I think so. So the main idea behind this paper is that, well, measuring deregulation is hard, you know, like the existing tools that we have, they face sharp trade-offs. There are a few measures around. So for example, one can go and count the number of rules on the Federal Register, but this will treat all rules equally. And then actually one thing that we learned is that you cannot distinguish direction. For you to deregulate, you need a rule. So just counting rules is not going to tell you much. There's some keyword-based news index, but these are, it's difficult to separate the regulation from regulation. Some more like firm level measures, they are granular, but end up being very narrow in scope. So say you want to think about pharma deregulation, then you have some more specific. And then you have some cross-country indexes, but they are quite infrequent. So what we do in this paper, we're going to use a large language model to construct a comprehensive high-frequency deregulation index for the US since 1960 on a daily basis and study its economic effects. Just if you find the rest of the presentation boring, this is the whole paper in one slide. We have a news-based deregulation index using based on newspapers, using large language models. We capture every major deregulation wave in the US and show that it has shifted over time, the scope. We compare with another measure that looks only at the Federal Register, actual rules that have been implemented, and we find that news lead formal implementation by almost 1 year. We have a VAR with the macro effects of higher deregulation. We find that GDP, investment, productivity, and stock prices increases after deregulation waves, and it's mildly deflationary. We do some panel regression of industry returns on industry-specific deregulation. We find positive effects on industrial returns. And we have a third measure which is based on earnings calls. And we find that like deregulation sentiment, firms end up increasing investment in response to self-reported expected deregulation. Okay. So how do we construct this? Our baseline method is we look at all news articles published at the New York Times from 1960 to 2025. These are about 2.5 million articles. And we do a two-stage approach. First, we're going to separate articles that actually discuss regulation. That gives us about 600,000 articles. After that, we're going to take each one of these articles and run through ChatGPT and ask the following questions. Is this an article talking about deregulation? And if it is, give me a score from 0 to 1 of intensity on deregulation. What does that mean? Is that if the article is just mentioning something en passant about deregulation, it's going to get a 0, 0.2. But if it's a major deregulation measure like implemented, is going to be close to 1. So we can capture the extensive and the intensive margins of deregulation with this sort of measure. So our key elements of the prompt, again, like we need to define what deregulation. For us, deregulation is the reduction or elimination of government regulations. We have a 6-point intensity scale. Goes from 0, which is like, doesn't talk about deregulation at all, or this is an article talking about higher regulation, all the way to 1, which is a major federal law enacted. We can distinguish something like advocacy, proposals to and enacted measures through this intensity scale. And then past events, we also put it as 0. We want to know what's happening now. Okay? And these are a few examples of what sort of like articles are driving our index. So for example, this is an article that our AI model scored as 1. This is an article centered on major federal deregulation. It's about providing airlines the broadest freedom in 40 years to compete for passengers by lowering fares. So there's broad scope. It's not a historical mention. So this is the type of article that ended up like driving during major reforms. Now, this is one that actually received a 0.2, so very low deregulation index. Deregulation is just a brief aside. Basically says that Greenspan noted that foreign purchase of treasuries, they're going to affect the economy, so that globalization benefits the US and the rest of the world. There's some innovations in deregulation. So it's a very en passant mentioning on deregulation that gets 0.2. It's not really focused. And why using the AI on this like is helpful, because we can actually get rid of like type 1 and type 2 errors. So for example, this is an article that got a score of 0. It's called Ballet, Some 19th Century Traditional by Workshop. But when you read it, it's there. Alexandra Danilova staged the second act of Swan Lake along more or less regulation lines. So if I search articles talking about less regulation, this would be an article of less regulation. I didn't know what less regulation lines were in ballet. Now then I read about it's about regular way of doing the Swan Lake. So that's the article here. Anyway, it gets a 0. ChatGPT correctly classifies this is not about economic deregulation. We do this with all articles, and the way that we aggregate this, we're going to have like a daily index in which we're going to sum all the scores of each one of those articles over time, and we're going to normalize this by total number of New York Times articles. This is one of the reasons that we normalize by the number of articles, that historically the number of articles the New York Times has been dropping, especially when we start like with the internet. Okay. We also have a measure with the Washington Post and the Chicago Tribune as kind of like a robustness. They tell basically the same story. The correlations are high. It's higher than 0.9. But so our baseline is with the New York Times. And this is how it looks like. So we have like our measure since 1960. It's daily. And again, I'll mention in the end, all the data is available in our website for you guys to go and play around. But you can see that the deregulation comes in waves. So we got like during the Reagan in the 80s, our measure spikes. In 1996, during the deregulation wave done by Clinton, with like a lot of like telecom, banking reform, the Glass-Steagall repeal Telecom Act, and the first and second Trump presidency, where it's when these measures usually spike. Okay. Okay, so we have an index. There's a lot of stuff that can be done. There's a lot of additional information. A few extra things that we try to understand the movements on this index is the following. Okay, I have now a set of articles that talks about deregulation. I can ask AI to give me a little bit more information on that. So for example, a few questions that we do a follow-up over those articles that talk about deregulation is that, okay, is this deregulation that's being mentioned on this article is about proposed or enacted measures? Which sector is being affected by deregulation? What type of deregulation is mentioned? And which country is the deregulation about? So when we do these cuts in our measure, first we see that when we separate the articles that talk about proposed and enacted, that the articles talking about proposed, they lead the articles talking about enacted measures, which is essentially what we would expect out of this type of measure. When we look at sectors, then we can actually tell kind of like a narrative story of what sectors are being deregulated and when. So you can see, for example, so what you see here is a heat map over the history among the own sector. So when it's more like there's more deregulation happening in each one of those sectors. So you can see, for example, in the 1960s, that it was quite broad across several sectors, while you have like health around the like prior to the COVID and during COVID, which was a lot of like Medicare deregulation, and then several measures that happened during the pandemic, and also like in the more current the current administration as well. So you can actually pinpoint what were the sectors that have been deregulated. We also ask what type of deregulation that is being happening over time. So we see a shift on the areas of deregulation. In the 70s, we see that deregulation that was more related to price dominated. So this was a lot of like breaking monopoly of industries, while from the 80s onward, they are more about product and service standards, which gives a little bit more of a compliance cost reduction. Also, if we actually ask if the deregulation that's being done, like if it mentions increased profits or increased competition or decreased prices, we also see this shift. So the regulation about increasing competition has been dropping. So more early on to the 90s were more about increasing competition, while the current one seems to be more related to increased profits, which would favor incumbents over new entrants. So this, with that, we can kind of get this historical shift on the type of deregulation that has been happening. Finally, we also ask, in terms of like cuts, we also ask which country is being affected there. If it's talking about deregulation like in a global setup, so we can actually make cuts based on countries or regions. So you can see, for example, we get the Latin American liberalization in the 90s. It captures it quite well. We have like the fall of the Soviet Union when we look at the Eastern Europe and Russia and so on. So we have like a sort of like a country cut as well. Okay. And finally, we also construct a measure that's the flip side of deregulation. In our prompt is pure deregulation, like is this article talking about deregulation or not? We can do the flip side of the prompt. Is this article talking about increased regulation or not? And that's the comparison that we have here with the red line. So one thing that you can see is that deregulation comes in waves. Like it's very linked to also like presidential terms. While the regulation or higher regulation, we have like this slow increase movement over time. So it's much more stable, the increase in regulation than actual deregulation waves. Okay. Good. These are news about deregulation. These are people talking about deregulation. does it really capture actual measures that are happening around? We thought about, well, like the easiest way to try to compare that, every single, if you want to deregulate in the US, you need a new rule. And every single rule is published every day in the Federal Register website of the US government. So what we did, let's do a similar exercise. Let's run an AI over every single rule that has been published in the Federal Register and ask if those rules are about deregulation, and if they are, like what's like the intensity of the economic intensity of that. So we collect 120,000 Federal Register documents. These are rules and executive orders since 1995. This is what is available. And we classify these documents also in terms of like of deregulation or not. And this is for me the most interesting picture of the paper. The blue line is the one constructed from the New York Times. The red is constructed from the Federal Register. These are completely different data sets. One is people talking about deregulation, the other is actual rules deregulating. And we can see that the news anticipates the actual changes in regulation by about 1 year, with a correlation of about 0.8 during the period. Great. Since these are federal rules, I can actually know which agencies are deregulating. With that, I can also do some sort of like classification in terms of like what are the major agencies or major sectors deregulating. And again, you can see that, for example, in 1996, this was quite broad-based among agencies, while in the most recent periods, both on Trump 1 and Trump 2, you see a lot of deregulation being done through executive orders, which also tells why it's shorter between the talk on the news and the actual implementation. Okay. Great, what we do with that? Let's see what actually happens with the economy after these deregulation waves. So essentially what we do a 15 variable Bayesian VAR, quarterly data from 62 to 2025, with the usual suspects in a macroeconomic VAR. We have a lot of like real side measures and some financial variables as well. We include in our VAR both our regulation index and the deregulation index, and we're going to do an identification that's recursive. Essentially, I'm going to do a shock on this deregulation index and see what are the economic effects after this deregulation waves with usual Minnesota priors. And this is what happens. So the shock is here. This is a 1 standard deviation shock in our deregulation measure. After a deregulation shock, what you see is that productivity doesn't change, basically on impact, but it increases in the long run, while GDP reacts positively both on impact and in the medium run. And this is mostly driven by investment. So investment has like a very strong reaction. One interesting thing here is the timing. Investment reacts much earlier than actually productivity increases. So this is very similar to a technological news shocks, for example. So it's information that you know that you're going to be more productive in the future. You need to invest now to actually absorb or explore the potential deregulation. Consumption, there's nothing much going on, but like, so most of the movement comes from investment. On the additional variables, we find that it's mildly deflationary, government expenditure and corporate profit tax rate, they don't move, so we're not really capturing a fiscal shock. We try to be very clear also in our prompt of excluding fiscal movements. This is about deregulation. See some reduction in uncertainty proxed by the VIX, and very positive effects in stock prices and also in confidence after this deregulation shock. Okay. And this is quite robust to doing alternative ordering, different samples, smaller VAR, less lags, controlling for the pandemic or not. The effects, see, these are the effects on investment. They're quite robust. Great. Now, I can ask, as I mentioned before, what are the sectors being deregulated? So we actually have sectoral deregulation measures. One thing that we try to do here is the following. Okay, like we find on the aggregate level that deregulation increases stock prices, investment, and so on. So let's try to capture a little bit if like the cross-section information over the sectors also gives us additional insights on that. So what we did is we get our sectoral deregulation indexes, and we match with the 49 industry portfolios from the FAMA French of stock price returns. And then we do a deregulation shock to see if that also, we can also find effects on industry returns coming from this sectoral deregulation shocks. And what we find is that indeed, stock returns, they do increase on impact, and including after 1 month, and then of course moves back to zero, but then there's a strong and positive response on stock price returns on impact, also coming from this more cross-sectional information. And it's also robust to different controls that we include, the type of if you put two-way clustering or time-fixed effects as well. Okay. Finally, so we have evidence that aggregate macroeconomic investment increases. When you look at sectoral deregulation, stock returns also increases. But if it's really true that firms there's news about deregulation, firms go and invest expecting this deregulation that's going to be put in practice, this should also be reflected among, say, for example, earnings calls of firms that are traded in the market. So essentially what we did, let's do a third measure. Let's look at earnings calls since 2006 is what we have available on public listed firms. These are about 220,000 earnings calls. And we're going to look at earnings calls that have deregulation related, and we have some analysis on distributional implications, how recent deregulation, they're increasingly associated with higher profits and not so much about competition, which may favor incumbents over new entrants. To finish, all the data is available in our website on a daily basis, aggregate, sectoral, federal register, everything's there if you guys want to play around with the index. That's it.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. So I'm Douglas Araújo here from the Central Bank, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here. So I thank my colleagues who organized this event for the opportunity to discuss this paper. I worked with regulation myself for more than 8 years, so this is an important topic for me, and I think also for the broader literature as well, just given the role that regulations have in corporate finance and firm decision, and then ultimately on welfare. So a very interesting paper to discuss. Okay, I can move. So a very brief summary from my perspective. So what they do, they use large language models. In this case, one model by ChatGPT. We'll go into more detail later if we have the time, to classify essentially all New York Times articles that mention regulations that form even belay ones, regulation lines, from 1960 all the way to probably yesterday. And they also have the good practice of human validation on some of these articles. And so they're able to calculate an index for regulation versus deregulation. They put an intensity score. They also differentiate between type of the regulation and the stage, if it's a proposal or if it's an actual enacted deregulation, geography, etc. And a central claim of the paper is that by doing a news-based index, they bypass the problem that if you just count different regulations, well, some of them might be changing a footnote in a small corner of regulation that no one really cares about, whereas another one might have huge implications for capital allocation in the economy. So you sort of you're more or less getting into the economic relevance of each regulation or deregulation by virtue of news reporting. And the results, very interesting index. What they show is that even though regulation tends to be more or less stable, aside from the most recent period, deregulation comes and goes in waves, is what we with experience in the sector we call the regulatory pendulum. The swings over time. We had the great financial crisis, for example, in finance. The great financial crisis came in. We went through a lot of regulation, and then this deregulation wave. So these things come and go over time. And then, well, they actually go to the enacted regulations in the Federal Register, which is the equivalent, I guess, for the U.S. Official Gazette, and they show that actually tracks. So the news are first does discuss proposed regulations, and then they're enacted more or less 1 year later. And then they go to analyzing the economic effects. So it mimics technology news shocks, for example. Investment grows, GDP grows, productivity grows slowly over time, but then ultimately gets there according to the results. And then also profit and GDP, and the industry sector, specifically regulation, has even more robust effects for sector level, firm level investment. I really like the paper. I really like reading the paper, and also I think the contribution that it makes to the literature is a significant one. It really does fill a gap in terms of measuring the regulatory activity, and I also really like the fact that it was measured separately from regulatory activity. And so I see this as a major contribution to the whole literature of economics of regulation. Making forecasts is very hard, especially about the future, but I would guess that this paper is going to be heavily cited, and because I think it fills very nicely this gap. In addition to this, the time series itself, as you mentioned, Danilo, is available publicly on the website, is updated frequently. You have sector breakdown, and it's easy to access, and I'll get into more of that later. So this discussion will focus more, some of the things that, the very few things that I think this paper can improve, and kind of address some of the shortcomings to really kind of get it there in terms of speaking about the economics, but also kind of really, staying up to the category contribution that I know it can give. So let me focus first on the claim that news coverage relates to economic relevance. I think broadly this makes sense. Tracks. If something's important, it's going to appear in the news, especially broad-based news outlets such as the New York Times. But I'd like to offer some counterexamples that show that sometimes regulations are very significant, but they're not maybe even reported at all. So in my field, banking regulation, let me just focus on one, derivatives regulation. There's an acronym. You actually need a PhD in math just to understand what the acronym means. It's the standardized approach for counterparty credit risk. It's such a complex rule that it's very detailed, very technical. So probably not the type of thing that the New York Times will be interested in reporting, but it just happens to be incredibly significant for banks. For example, in the US, which is the case you focus more, it's so significant that the industry managed to push back on the Federal Reserve and other regulating agencies' efforts to regulate to implement this type of regulation, precisely because it was so significant. They eventually managed to do so, but as I will show you, it was actually not reported. So I would suggest you to add more nuance to the claim that news coverage equates or relates closely to economic relevance. It might often not be the case. So for example, 2019, the agencies, they finally managed to implement the SACCR. So you can see in the website, they even use the acronym, etc. But if I search in the New York Times website, a very quick Google search, it's just not there. And I would be very surprised if they ever reported on such a technical thing. Now, moving beyond this, again, so that aside, I think the series tracks well with at least what my experience and my intuition would be. But let me go now into some more kind of econometric detail. Are deregulation shocks really shocks? Is something that I question myself reading the paper. The reason is, in my experience, and I know also from other fields, highly regulated industries, they typically are in close contact with regulators. And so, which means that whenever something appears in the press, they know already, sometimes years ahead of the wider public. And when it comes to deregulation, it's very often a proposal that they created in the first place. So I would be very cautious with, any claim that there's a shock. And my suggestion in general will be, just implement a bunch of econometric tests to show that if the series or some transformation of it is actually a shock, because then you can use in cool things. Like, for example, instead of doing a 15 variable var, which is hard to understand what's going on, you might actually do local projections, for example, would be much more interesting, conditional on the shock being really a shock, right? Or getting to the econometric theme of the VAR, I would claim that if you have a 15 variable var, and you use recursive identification, which means one variable depends structurally on the other, but just on the one that precedes it, and then you sort of do this lower triangle structure. It's carrying a lot of water, and I'm always skeptical when I see Cholesky with more than 4 variables, and a 15 variable, I'm like, no, I have to suggest either local projections or some structural equation modeling more directly. On that note, I would not encourage reporting impulse response functions with a 68% credible interval. I would argue that if this paper is important for the econometrics, for the index it creates, but also important for the policy-making lessons that it teaches. And if I'm a policymaker, I would never take any decision with a 68 credible interval. So that's the way I would put it. And presumably what this would do, for example, I guess some of these results would remain statistically significant, some would go away. But it's important to kind of own that. And in particular, the one about productivity, which is a result that you highlight in the paper. Let's assume that the 2-year, 3-year result goes away if we expand to a 95% interval. That's actually really important to know. And it's very important. So let me share one particular regulation. So of course, you look at all regulations from all sectors, from broad case. I'm looking just one regulation, a massive labor deregulation that we had in Brazil. And the stated purpose of this deregulation of the labor market in Brazil was to increase productivity. And the government at the time, they claimed that this would increase productivity growth by 1.5, 2 percentage points a year, whereas in fact, the effect was essentially null with the synthetic control method. Which, I mean, just tells us, okay, so even if you increase investment, you increase GDP consumption, productivity, so the long run effect of the regulation might be elusive. So it's very hard to increase productivity by changing rules. That's my point. And it's something important to own. And then finally, one point I would make as well is that sometimes we have, of course, the intuition from finance or from economics is that, so let's take aside the fact that, much of this regulation was probably even suggested by the industry in the first place. Let's assume that they first read it about it in the newspapers. Sometimes, I mean, there's evidence, at least again in my field in banking, that banks actually respond not to the announcement, but to the actual implementation. Maybe kind of a Hail Mary effect. Maybe they continue to argue with the regulator up until the regulation is actually in place. But there's some evidence by some BS colleagues, Tito Pangol, Ulf Leverick, and others, who show that. So the first year was when the GSIB implementation, so the global systemically importance capital surcharge for banks was announced. And then the second one, but actually the effect was only at actual implementation time, as you can see here in this graph. So I would also encourage you to explore a little bit of this as well. And then finally, very quickly, doing inference with machine learning constructed indices is now increasingly known to be something that is subject to econometric bias. The good news is that the standard deviation, standard errors, they're actually exactly the same. But the point estimates are biased. So I would encourage you to kind of read this paper. It's a very nice paper by Laura Batalha and others. And what they propose is sort of a joint estimation of the index and the model, the local projections or VAR you're proposing to analyze the data with. So this is the gist of my comments. I have more. Just like to encourage everyone to visit their website. It's a very nice way to export the data. You're going to find some interesting findings there as well. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Douglas. Would you like to react?
Yeah, very quick. I don't know. Okay. Thanks a lot, Douglas, for this excellent discussions. The first time that we actually have someone discussing the paper, so this was like very welcoming, and also for your nice suggestions and words on it. On what you're mentioning related to banking regulation, that indeed like maybe minor technical adjustments that have like a strong effect like on the banking may not be really captured in the New York Times. This is like we try to use the New York Times as like newsworthy, that we believe it's correlated with economic impact, but of course not like the perfect way. One alternative that would be good would be actually to do this with the Wall Street Journal, that would maybe capture that, but they don't give access to government employees, so we don't have that version. So, yeah. So our we do have a finance version which gets into your other comments for the deregulation, both on the aggregate and on the Federal Register, which in that one should be captured, even like minor adjustments. Well, with the Federal Register, what we actually do is that we feed not the actual rule, because that can be extremely technical. They can be talking about parts of an airplane, but we actually feed the abstract of the rule, which is made in a way that is being like concisely explained what the rule or the regulation is doing, and those on the finance should be there as well. So maybe like one alternative would also look at the actual implementation of the Federal Register. And that gets to your point related to the if the banks are actually reacting to the actual change and not to like news about it. We can do a similar exercise just looking at finance to see, for example, if like the news give like less like economic effects on that. Our whole point of using the news and not the Federal Register, like from the economic perspective, like in a general equilibrium thinking, is that the agents are forward-looking. They know that there will be a deregulation. This may affect productivity in the long run. They react now. If I put on the VAR the actual change, I'm losing all this preemptive effect behind. So it would be interesting to actually see if that's the case, just looking just at the finance. On the VAR and then on the identification, so point very well taken. So we show from a Bayesian perspective one standard deviation around the median response. I could also put like 2 standard deviation there, but we do have some exercise with much smaller VAR, just like with 4 variables, just 2 legs with like not Bayesian, pure frequencies. Results change quantitatively, but not qualitatively. They are all like on the same like ballpark of our main point. We try to emphasize more that like most of those results, they match what we would expect looking at, say, the industry level, the regulation, and also on the earnings calls. But yeah, there's still work to be done and adding that. And finally, I didn't know that paper on the joint estimation. I'm definitely going to look at it. There's a lot of like of discussion on also on replicability of like these measures, because ChatGPT, you ask the same question several times, they give you different answers, which is another point of using LLMs to construct this type of measures. But like there's a big discussion, especially like Melissa Dell, like have been bringing on that's kind of like that you need to start thinking about replicability of these measures from a statistical perspective, not from a point perspective. So.
We're taking questions from the audience now.
Thanks. This is absolutely incredible. This is really cool. Thanks for this. I was wondering 2 dimensions of regulation that would be interesting for us to know whether or not that's in the index. The first one is, given that we're in the US and there's a lot of like state-based regulations, I would like to know a little bit more how the index is capturing that. And then the second one, I guess coming from the IMF, like global regulation. So for example, if I think about Basel III, right? Like is the index capturing just like aggregate Basel III? Can we get a sense of like how much we think the country is exposed to the global regulation, so on and so forth? So that would be great. But overall, it's absolutely incredible paper.
Thanks.
A super interesting paper. This fills a gap in the literature. I wonder, there is a website where you can track the stock holdings of the Congress members. And there is an anecdote that every time you see a jump in the holdings of a particular stock, thereafter there is a change in the regulation. So it will be interesting to see whether you can see something there. This is more like anecdotal, but I think widely debate this idea that you can foresee what is going to happen by regulation by just looking at previous changes in the stock holdings of Congress members. The other thing that I was curious, many times happens, particularly in the airline industry, that you have the regulation on the making, but then at the very last minute, something that was discussed here, lobby works, and finally the regulation is not taking is not implemented effectively. So I wonder whether there is any way you can capture this idea that it happens very often. The regulation that is on the making, but then because of lobby, the regulation actually never happened. And what are the effects on the economy or something like that? Thank you.
Okay. Thanks a lot for the questions. So I think, and thanks for the comments. With our first question related to state-based, so we try to explicit in our prompt. I don't have the full prompt here, but like it's in the paper, that state or local rules, they are downplayed, so it would be classified, say, like a 0.2 or maybe 0.4. So it's downplayed in two ways. First, like the index is going to be lower, but also if it's something very state, something very local, there will be maybe 1 or 2 articles, not 20. So you get like it's downplayed both on the intensity and the extensive margin. And we do find that when we also like look at like changes in water in Ohio, and then those they end up like having a much less evaluation. On global, so one thing that we try to explicit there too is which countries are being affected, kind of like a directional basis. So like so if it's Basel III, US is being affected, it's going to be enter the US index. If it's affected by many other countries, it's going to enter their countries as well. I think like a more like clear example is we have to make a call on trade, for example, right? So trade liberalization, if it's between two countries, that's the regulation for both. If it's about and then we can capture that on if it's like it's a rule that increases on one side, it may be the regulation on one side and not the other. So that's how we end up like getting on the countryside, on the part. Stock holdings of Congress, I have zero to say about it. I have no idea if there's data or not, but that definitely should be like maybe like an interesting question to look at. This is purely about deregulation, and that also affect like stock market, but we don't have like any actually don't know if there's any data about like holdings from the Congress. Now, on changes, and that's actually a very interesting point that we can try to tackle, is that our index on the news base is talks about the regulation. The actual implementation may be different than that. So you can always think from an empirical modeling perspective is that the initial reaction in terms of like say investment is all based on this expectation of the measure being fully implemented. If it's not, at that point, it's going to be kind of like a surprise negative shock. I always make this comparison with like technological shocks. When you think about like news about future productivity, there's a reaction based on that. When the future comes and the productivity is not as great or even higher, you have a surprise shock. That's one way of thinking. And maybe like comparing with the actual implementation could be a way to go. We try to classify also if it's advocacy, so a lot of the articles are about advocacy or lobbying in favor of a rule or not, which we understand, especially like from looking at the sentiment calls, that firms actually make changes on the capex based on expected deregulation, that there is a more likelihood that's going to be passed.
Thank you. It's a really nice paper. I was wondering, your result seems to be very unequivocally positive towards deregulation. And I was wondering if they capture some of the long-term potential negative externalities of deregulating. Some regulations might be unequivocally positive, like breaking up monopolies. But then there are others that are a little bit more controversial, like financial deregulation or pharmaceutical deregulation. So I was wondering if you take any of that into account. And if not, maybe given that you have this long time series database, maybe you could do some of like backtracking of, I don't know, financial deregulation in the early 2000s and then the impact on that on the financial crisis in 2008. And then see, I don't know, some feedback that you can incorporate into the model and then control for that.
Yeah. So two things on that. So first, we try to get more like aggregate macro perspective of like deregulation waves by looking at specific sectors. There are several papers doing that, like looking just like at the effect of pharma, more like in a partial equilibrium part. So what we thought was like it was missing is more like on the aggregate. We don't get to the point of course, like if you cut the rule that was actually just a tax on firms, you're going to have like an increase like in GDP investment and that's it. But if it was something that actually expose you more to risk, then you will be more exposed to risk. In some sense, you do see the effect, for example, on the VIX that it reduces on impact, but in the medium run, there is some sort of increase on that. So one can always think that, like you cut the regulation, you have like a positive initial boost, but that exposes you to tail risk down the road, both on the upside and on the downside. So we don't get to that specific point. We're very like into like what are the aggregate economic effects of like the regulation waves.
Thank you, everyone. We actually don't have any more time for questions, but we're moving on to the next paper.
Okay, thank you all. And again, I'd like to thank the organizers really for the opportunity to present this paper. I think it's a privilege really because of the academic content and the academic discussions, but also because of the kind of a central bank focus of this conference as well. So this paper is called Harnessing Artificial Intelligence for Monitoring Financial Markets. And it's trying to work with Mateo Aquilina, Gaston Gelos, Tejin Pak, and Fernando Perez Cruz, all from the BIS. And as for the discussion, also this presentation as well, everything here is not necessarily the views of the Banco Central do Brasil or the BISs, but really our own views. So jumping right to the matter, we start from the acknowledgement that predicting financial market stress is incredibly difficult. Well, not only those episodes, they come from all sorts of different places in the financial market and different types of shocks, but also because even empirically, when you look at the numbers, those episodes they tend to be rare, thankfully, and this makes them very hard to model. But then also that the way they're created, the vulnerabilities that cause them are also, they tend to be unique in a way. But then even if we were able to actually have some forecasts, the real crucial part for policymakers to help them address the issue before it really kind of becomes a problem is to know where's problem brewing essentially. So what are some of the origins of stress? So essentially this puts us in a position where trying to forecast market stress is an important endeavor. But even if we have the point estimate, we also want to know a little bit about what is driving those forecasts. And now we have, of course, a bit more hope in accomplishing this, in part because central banks have been using machine learning techniques, artificial intelligence techniques in the recent years, and this has helped increase the analytical capability of central banks considerably, which combined with just the amount of data that we have available from financial markets, from other sources, could make for an interesting proposition. So this paper, what it does is in the first part, I will show you how we measure financial market stress. And here in this paper, we diverge from the practice of actually, collecting dates, associate them with events. And rather, we try and look for financial market proxies that, show us that financial market is not working really well. And they're going to be a proxy for, a situation where, the financial markets are really kind of dysfunctional. And it's based in kind of currency markets, which are highly liquid. They are extremely important for global financial system, which also makes them a good proxy. And I'll get into that about later. But then once we have this proxy, I hope to convince you that it is a good one. Then what we do, we use machine learning techniques, in particular a recurrent neural network, a type of neural network that we'll get into more detail later, to forecast this proxy for market stress. And then we try to do the following exercise. We forecast a 20-day average, so essentially a business month, but with a 60-day time lag. Essentially, if I'm sitting in a central bank and I have a 3-month advantage in knowing that something is going to happen or is likely to happen, a quarter from now, this would help me kind of prepare, or maybe even kind of attenuate or eliminate completely the probability that it actually does materialize. But the neural network that we introduced in this paper is actually a novel architecture that not only gives us the point estimate, but also tells us in which point in time, what were the variables that had the most signal to help this forecast. And this will then kind of be very informative. So the third part of the paper, we take the signals about which variables are important at each period for the forecast of the financial market dysfunction. And then we essentially, we go to a large language model, we feed it with financial market news or with whatever other data the central bank has available. And then we say, well, we're sensing a problem ahead. Here are the most important variables. Now, if you look at all this source material, what can you tell us about it? And then give us something that is actionable, that is interpretable by actual humans. And the purpose is that this guided LLM search of documents could then help supervisors or policymakers to really kind of make sense of what's going on or might be going on and then act accordingly. And we see this paper precisely because of this reason in these two different ways. One as an academic endeavor, but the other one also as a proof of concept for a tool that could help central banks kind of adopt something similar. So we're not trying to say, oh, we have the best model that forecasts this or that. This is not our claim. Our claim is that you can actually do something, combine these new technologies, and do something with data that you already have to produce actionable insights from data sets, and also with a time lag that allows you to actually act and prevent problems from materializing. Okay, so our proxy for market dysfunction, we look into the so-called triangular arbitrage parity. Essentially what this says is, if you're in a large liquid, a currency exchange market, and you have, let's say, the currency euro to yen, two very large currency pools, it should be exactly the same as converting euro to dollar and then dollar to yen. It doesn't make any sense that it would be different, because if you're a large bank, if you're a large hedge fund, as soon as you see a difference, and it's immediate, you have your Bloomberg screen open, and if there's any difference, you can immediately trade it off for a risk-free profit. So whenever, in normal times, this is very close to zero. Whenever markets don't function really well, there's going to be some level of friction. But as I will show you soon, this friction kind of tends to increase and kind of a spike in given times. It's often associated or close to or exactly on actual events in financial markets. Now, the reason is, of all the possible arbitrage possibilities that the banks and large investors have, this is the one that's easiest to close. It has zero tax implication. They can do it immediately. They don't have to wait or transfer the money to another jurisdiction. It all happens in those global currency pools. So what we do is we take a minute-by-minute measure of this TAP deviation, and then for each day, we just do the standard deviation. And we do the standard deviation, not the mean, because sometimes the mean might offset. If you have a large deviation with one sign, it might offset with another, with opposing one. But all we care about is if this deviation is kind of occurring in that particular day. So we have a daily series of standard deviations, which is the blue line in this graph. So it's kind of squiggly all around, but you can see that it spikes. The vertical dashed lines, they are actual market events, like big financial firms failures or something like this. And then the orange line is a 20-day average, and this is our left-hand variable, the 20-day average, because again, our purpose is not to try and pin down, we're gonna have a stress in 15th of August, but rather to say in the 20-day period starting 15th of August, we might have a higher probability of a stress, so we should act now. And the reason why we use these models, I mean, they can very easily incorporate large data sets and nonlinearity, and essentially most of the advantages that I'm seeing here, that I'm showing you formally here, come from, what Elizabeth showed later, is the fact that they regularize very well, and they tend to have kind of a very flexible functional forms. But usually these models, they don't always give us the explainability that we need to kind of help disentangle what's driving or where signal for this forecast is coming from. So what we do is we take 125 financial market variables. We initially explored some combinations and other moments of these variables, but actually as it happens, we don't need to do this because in a way, the neural network already transforms the data in the most useful way for us. So what this means is we take 125 different variables of all corners of financial markets, all the way from FX markets to options, to government bonds, etc. And okay, so let me skip the literature. And then we pass through this model here. Actually, it's 2 slides. This is the building block, and then I'll get to our actual model or a stylized version. This is, some of you might not have seen this before. It's called a recurrent neural network. So I won't get into the detail of what a neural network is. You can think of it as, kind of a highly effective nonlinear function. A recurrent one, what it says is you have the first block here. Okay. So let's go from left to right. You have that green square with the letter A. That's essentially the piece of a recurrent neural network. And then it sees the data for a period T. And it has some output H. Output H and the period T+1 data will go into the exact same network with the exact same parameters. So essentially, it's kind of the network learns to accumulate whatever state is going on, but in a flexible way. It doesn't have fixed parameters for a given time lag or a given variable. Every period, it decides which new information is important to accumulate in the state H, and which one you can just discard away and use whatever data from that period is. What this gives us is the possibility to combine these recurrent neural network blocks and do the following architecture. That is one of our main contributions in this paper. So we have different variables. Instead of 125, I didn't have the patience to do 125 blue circles, so I did just 3. So we have data for a period. Each one is a different variable, and they all go through the same recurrent neural network in the first block here, which is the variable selection. And the output is not our forecast for the market dysfunction. The output is rather different weights, one for each variable. And these weights are then multiplied by the same variables that came in through this first RNN, recurrent neural network block, in the first place. And then we have the weighted variables. And what's nice about it is that now that we have weighted variables, we then put these weighted variables into a second RNN block, which is now only working as a forecaster. Essentially, it's saying, I have a bunch of weighted signals, and I want to forecast market dysfunction with a 3-month distance between now and my forecast. So what happens is that, and these RNN blocks, they are optimized jointly, which means that the forecast Y, our tap deviation measure that I showed you, the orange line, which is a 20-day average for the blue line, that variable is used. So we want to forecast that variable, actually not T, but T+60, sorry for the typo, jointly optimizing for how we weight the variables and then how we use the weighted variables to forecast. So this is our main contribution, because then in addition to the forecast, we're going to look at the weights themselves, and they're going to tell us, well, maybe, for example, we have a forecast that we see a crisis looming or a stress period looming ahead, and then we can tell which variables contributed the most for this forecast, conditional on all of the past history up until that point. So this is our forecast. By the way, we use a 3.5-year out-of-sample period, so it's the model, everything after this vertical line, the model is stale. It's fitted only to data prior to that line, which means that, results, the more recent results, they're using a somewhat stale model, but as I will argue, it continues to function well. So what do we see here? In the green line is the actual a standardized a value for the tap deviations. Again, the 20-day average. In orange, we have an AR prediction, but also with a 60-day lag. And in blue, the blue is the predicted, and then the blue is the real recurrent neural network prediction. And as you can see here, kind of in the auto sample period, which is what we care about, let's say after 2023, more or less, it kind of diverges in levels from the actual value, but the dynamics continue to follow the green line, which is something I'll show more formally later. Okay, so what does this mean? So we do two types of tests on the quality of our model. One of them is the traditional Diebold-Mariano test, and essentially what it does is, if you compare the loss of two different models, how do they compare, with a formal statistical test? And we compare with an autoregressive model with our recurrent neural network-based prediction. And then we have a second test, which is a so-called forecast relevance test, which essentially answers the question. We're sitting here today, 15th of May, and we only have the forecast, the AR forecast and the RNN forecast. What does it tell us about the 20-day period that starts in 15th of August? Okay, so essentially, if you control for any level difference, what does it tell you about the dynamics, whether it's going up or down? Since you woke up today, you want to know what you're going to do about the future, right? So is your forecast today relevant to explain the dynamics of the level and the constant, or the dynamics in the slope of let's say the future data? So the Diebold-Mariano tests are the first two columns, and our model does not do incredibly well against AR. It does not beat AR, and in fact, AR wins by a horse's head margin compared to ours, if we compare the loss as a root mean squared error loss. But in the forecast relevance tests, which we argue is most important, essentially tells there's a constant, meaning that our forecast differs in levels to the actual data. But crucially, there's a slope, there's a coefficient on our forecast, meaning that if our forecast goes up, then essentially also the future market dysfunction is very likely to go up as well, again, using only the 3.5-year auto sample data. And then we also do this, even when we add the AR forecast, it's essentially irrelevant to add information today about future values using when you already have our forecasts. Okay, so now let's talk about the weights. I like to call them the colorful spaghetti, because if you just plot the 125 different variables and all of them at each date, all the weights must sum up to 1. Okay, so if you have these weights are competitive, meaning that if any given variable has more signal, then essentially it crowds out the signal from other variables, which is what makes this interesting. Because what we see here is that over time it shifts a lot. So we only plotted here the most significant variables for the auto sample period, and you can see that even in those variables, kind of the variable with the most signal for the forecast kind of changes significantly. So because of time, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. Just want to now tell you a bit about how this connects with the third part. We add in the paper the following exercise, which at the time we were writing the paper was the most kind of a recent thing that went on in financial markets. Essentially, there was this kind of different perceptions about communication of the Bank of Japan's kind of a monetary policy decision. This led to some market turbulence at the time. So what we did was, and this happened in the 5th of August of 2024. So we took some financial news from the prior days, and we fed a large language model, and we asked to explain, kind of if something were to happen in the following days, what would be let's say, the origins of the stress. And then, I mean, you can read in the paper. I'm not going to read out loud here, but essentially, kind of it gives us 3 possibilities. One of them actually turns out to be the correct one, which was very interesting, but kind of not very
kind of informative for our case, because we also need to combine this with the weights that we measure in the second part of the paper, in the forecast. So what we do is the following: we create a prompt, and then in this prompt we add we want to know that here's a bunch of financial news that we have from July, and sitting in July 2023, the most important variables at the time were these ones that you're seeing here. Now, what are some of the things that will be important for a financial supervisor to know based on these financial news and based on the variables that we see are more important for explaining deviations from triangular arbitrage parity? Essentially, those variables have the most signal to explain arbitrage market dysfunctions. What can you tell us about, kind of summarize the news that are related to this in a way that people can actually read and not just see squiggles going up and down? And then, interestingly, it does bring forth some of the things that we know at the time of writing, but not at the time of, let's say, we would not have known this at the time of that date cutoff that we use. That actually helped to explain the episode of the Treasury tantrum that occurred later that year in October 23. Okay. One of the things we want to do, as I said, we want this to be part of central banks and other policymakers' toolboxes. So we are actually working very hard to make this code available so we can also run this neural network architecture that, in addition to the prediction, also gives you the weights for each variable over time. And it's part of the BIS maintained open source package called Gingado. So if you want to scan this QR code, you have access to documentation, you can install the package. And if you visit there in a couple of weeks, in some weeks, hopefully you'll find the code for this neural network as well, in addition to other tools that you might find helpful. Okay, so to conclude, I see a lot of potential in this newer techniques, both from an econometric perspective, but also from a, let's say, informational work process flow perspective, meaning how do you go from data points or graphs or colorful spaghettis to actually texts and things that humans can understand and read and discuss and show to policymakers. I think there's a lot of way that we can go in this direction. But in particular, one of the things we need to do in order to really harness this is to try and open up this black box that many of these models are, so we can actually go and have a peek view inside and see what's going on and what are driving predictions. And in particular, large language models, I know they can help, especially when they are informed by some of these models, like I showed you, they can help supervisors, economists, analysts to kind of really sift through this incredible amount of richness of data that we have, textual data that we have, to really focus on what's important and help find the needle in the stack. So thank you very much again, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and comments you might have. Thank you.
Esse aqui. Perfeito. Obrigado. So she told me that I need to speak closer to this microphone. It's usually for 6 foot tall people, not 6'5". The last 2 papers are very interesting, even though I'm discussing the last one, but both of them talk a lot about large language models and something that lots of people are researching and spreading, across different areas. I'm glad to see that more often in macro finance applications in economics. In economic, things tend to come a little bit like later, not due to laziness, but to caution, to see if these things are going to pin down or if they're going to stabilize. My discussion is going to be very short, which is actually pretty good because I didn't know I was going to be the last one of the whole meeting, and we are already like 10 minutes after the time. So I wrote my discussion on a paper, and then I sent it to my friend Claudio, like Claude, and then he gave me like some pictures, some funny pictures. And so I just decided to leave it there just to show you how these things work. By the way, I've been using that a lot to create like homeworks and synthesize my own notes. I'm not even going to read that because he explained so well the combination of two structure from machine learning or statistics, whatever you want to call, large language models being used to help neural networks and vice versa. So it's one unique usage. In particular, he's using this RNN to predict this euro-yen tap. I didn't know there was a formal name for that because you always travel and then you exchange money to this and that, and then you realize that you're going to pay some fees and there might be some arbitrage. And, anyway, so that's an interesting variable to use to capture the stress. So if there is if that's changing a lot, that means that there's some stress and then you want to capture that. And there are all these slides here, but I want to already pose two questions. One is something that has already happened 15 years ago, 10 years ago with these models, text models in statistics, which is and that's also valid for you. I mean, you guys are creating indices for time series that will be used, in modeling. But there are dynamic text modeling available. So is that too difficult to incorporate in the analysis to dynamically, learn the text? Because, for instance, when you have 100 texts, like 100 documents on a particular day, you ask, like you did, ask a few questions, and then you summarize that and you get an index. When you do that the next day, there's no reason to believe that they are not related somehow, or at least a latent variable that goes through them, like a feature, right? The old latent Dirichlet allocation type of, LLMs or models. The second L is not there because it's not that large, but it was when the origin of machine learning documents for text, like factor analysis for text, right? So I think this, at least questioning that, like how learning. Because one of the things you mentioned is that you have documents from 1960, and the number of articles appear more or less more frequent or not, and then of course you take the average. But if you have less documents, the variance is going to be bigger. But you're treating all of them in the same way. So how that changes if you are adapt to, because from 1960 to now, everything changes. So whatever was like an important document there is not now. Okay, so you do a cross section, but then. How they relate over time. There must be like a smooth transition between these documents. That was one thing. Interpretability is something that people are doing these days in machine learning. Like even computer scientists are now getting interested into trying to identify variables that are important in these black boxes. And I think this is one point that you take care of very successfully. And I really want to congratulate you guys on doing this. What else? This is like more like a summary of what you guys did. There are some things about, someone mentioned in some of the other discussions about bias. So this is another thing that I want to ask you about, like what's going on these days, at least within your area, about bias. Because bias can come from several different sources, right? I mean, there is also like a causal effect here. Like when you see some of these pictures, you see some delays in some gaps, something anticipating. Is that a causal anticipation or not? I mean, whenever someone does regulation, is because there was like a path of information that led to that. So that path of information is in the documents. So is there a causal? I mean, there was that regulation because of this path of information. So it's not like forecasting. We're just like, well, this is going to happen because I'm already discussing that. So there are other types of biases that appear over there. And just to finalize, I have a couple of not recommendations, just like maybe this cross-asset scaling, like expand to other, I mean, making a multivariate model out of this. I mean, how can you do that? Can you simultaneously, you're doing like one, the Japanese euro, but if you, as you know, that there is all these other currencies, but if you put all of them in a vector, they are somehow intrinsically like related, because two of them are related to the other one, and if you divide one by the other, has to be the third one. So a multivariate version of this would be a nice thing to as an extension, right? Yeah, I think that was my main concern. The other ones was basically on something that I read there. I don't think it's. I can send this to you, and it's basically. I'm more interested in. You guys are already doing this job of bringing LLMs, neural networks, to very complicated issues, but there is a time series component in both papers. And as a time series person, I'm always thinking about, okay, but what is the time series aspect? It's a direct estimation, so you keep moving a block, but there is no memory in the process. So it's a price. It's a price you pay when you do when you try to do these models, trying to replicate what a cross session would do, but you have a time series. So RNN is a way to try to adapt to that, but it has some flaws as well. So those are my comments to both of you, actually.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to have a paper discussed like this. Let me focus. Thank you. I really appreciate that. So 2 comments that I respond to in the interest of time, and then of course we can follow up bilaterally. One of them very quickly about the bias, and the other one about the time series aspect. So as I showed in the forecast, when we look at our forecast, out of our sample forecast, the level is off in the latter period, which again is maybe a product of the model being stale at that point, maybe a product of the model really not capturing some other thing we might not be looking at, which is why we thought of using that forecast relevance test to really kind of pin down and kind of clean out our contribution from the model, from the level to the actual dynamics, which is what we're interested in. And thankfully, we do find that even in the latter period, the dynamics continue to be informative. So in a way, it's a way to say, okay, we acknowledge there's bias, but if you disregard this fact and you focus on the really useful part, we can see that the model is informative. And about the time series aspect, one thing I didn't mention because of time, but it was the whole reason actually why we chose to model this as a recurrent neural network, is that contrary to traditional econometric models where once you estimate the parameters, each parameter has, for example, in a var, beta for the first leg is always the slope with respect to the first leg of a given variable. With RNNs, they're kind of special in the sense that they, at each point in time, they more or less choose, let's say informally, which memory of the past to retain and which one to throw away, which means that if you have a model like we have that spans, let's say, the global financial crisis or European sovereign crisis, and then it might, once it escapes the traditional window of an econometric model, it's no longer influencing the model. But with RNNs, if information from those eras, from those episodes, continues to be relevant to forecast today, they will be retained somehow in the memory of the model, which is kind of the whole beauty of RNNs. But yeah, so in the interest of time, I'll cut it there, but happy to hear any other views you all might have.
We're taking questions now from the audience, or
That was super cool paper. One thing that I was thinking, it's because you clearly have this like issue with the level. Have you tried like modeling the changes, or just the change after on the out of sample? Because like your model should definitely beat the AR on the changes, or maybe like even a detrended version. Estimate you first detrend everything to take out some like structural movements, and then you estimate the neural network. Because like it's quite interesting. Like you really capture the movements after, so the difference should beat the AR.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very interesting question. So essentially, why don't we transform the Y variable so we can, since we're good at forecasting the dynamics, so we can go and kind of achieve this. The main reason is that these models, they're informally here, they're so good optimizers that
I mean, depending on how you transform them, you might have look-ahead bias if you do the same transformation in the out-of-sample period. So we didn't want to do any type of kind of trend or anything. The only thing we did, which is normal practice in neural network estimation, is we standardized the model, but using only the data, using only in-sample mean and moments, which might even be a source of the bias itself if the moments of the data explode in the out-of-sample period changes. So that's the whole reason we wanted to say, look, we estimate a model that has a novel architecture, but we do it in the most standard possible way, so we can claim that the contribution is from the architecture, not from whatever transformation we do. But thanks, it's a very interesting idea for a practical application.
So my question is about the rationale behind choosing an LSTM instead of a vanilla RNN or GPU or a convolutional form, because LSTM are usually used to address the question of long memory and persistency, and the currencies you choose form a particularly high liquid market, and we would expect that these arbitrage opportunities would be really, really short-lived.
Yeah, thank you for these questions. So I'll start from the end. And indeed, so do we. We also expect, whatever divergences are between the euro, dollar, and yen to be very brief. But as it happens, they not only occur and they sometimes last more than a day, they're also pretty frequent, as you saw in the graph. They spike, for example, every quarter end, they spike. So what this tells us is that, financial markets, they tend to work well whenever they work well, but there are moments, and these moments are not rare, when simply it's dysfunctional. I think this is the word that we use. And we chose the euro-yen pair precisely because those are two extremely liquid currencies. Each one of them counts with a number of major banks that could easily go into the market and make money, but all of them choose not to in those periods, which is striking. Now, to your question, so for those of you that are not from the field, LSTM is one particular type of recurrent neural network. There are other types. We chose LSTM, which is short for short-term memory, precisely for the reason you mentioned. I mean, it's a kind of a standard application. It's also very good at retaining memory flexibly, meaning that our model running in 2024 probably has some memory from what happened in the euro crisis, and this was an important aspect for us. Thank you.
One last question.
I'd just like to ask how long are the sequences that you pass to the network, and what is the granularity of the inputs? And I also would like to ask, when you have an alert that the volatility, the opportunity for the gap between the prices of the currencies, when you find that there will be this gap, you're sort of using it as a proxy for an actual economic incident. And how precise is that? Like, how often are you going to get false alerts from this proxy?
Well, thank you. Good questions. So the question about the size of the kind of the period window, if I understood correctly. So when you're training those RNNs, essentially you need to give them a fixed window of data, and then you train them. It's like, think about for those of you that are not from the field, of the zipper slider. You have the zipper slider. It's always looking at a fixed window, but then of course it acts on the whole kind of zipper chain. So the window we use is essentially 1 business year, so 250 business days. And then once the model is trained with this, it does not mean that it will only retain memory from 1 year window. It might learn to retain longer windows, which is why you use this in the first place. The other question, can you please remind me what the question was again? Oh yeah, thank you. The false alerts. So the whole purpose of our forecast relevance equation was to see, kind of on average, do we have will we capture the dynamics? And I mean, because the point estimate, which is statistically significant, was positive, we take it to mean, but less than 1, we take it to mean that, we're not going to capture everything, but it's unlikely that we're going to have false positives. At least it's much less likely than having false negatives. But having said this, it's hard to speak about false positive or false negative with a continuous variable like that one that does not have a theoretical maximum. So we can't claim, oh, here's a very good true positive prediction. So which is why you use that test and not other tests from the statistical literature as well. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for staying to the end. Special thanks to Danilo, Gilberto, and Douglas. Angela would like to say a few words before we all go to lunch.
A small adjustment on the microphone because us large guys, former basketball players, we have to always change the microphone. This is the last session of our 2026 Banco Central do Brasil conference. Here to just say a few words, just basically thanking everyone, our presenters, moderators, everyone who stayed here from the beginning till the end. We had, I think, a great conference. For us at the Central Bank of Brazil, we definitely learn a lot. Our staff actually learn a lot having these interactions from the academia, from other central banks. So for us, it was really important. This conference is incredibly important. We truly hope that for those who came from other places that you actually also enjoyed the conference. We'd like to thank the support from our deputy governor and his staff, especially in the person of João, who was the one who basically coordinated every logistical details in terms of travel arrangements, hotel staying. So thank them. I would like to thank our communications teams who also handle all the details on the hall and the food and transportation. So thank all of them. Special thanks to our sponsor, FGC. Hope this partnership stays for quite a long time. Think it was useful for us. Hope, given the topics that we actually discussed, not only here, but also in the other sessions, important for whoever is viewing or overviewing the Brazilian financial system. And that's it. We're going to serve lunch on the hallway. Hope for those who came from other places have a safe travels back. And we hope to see you next year. Thank you.